Hi everyone! I hope you're all having a great evening. It looks like people are continuing to trickle in. Um, my name is Rebecca and I'm a bookseller at Belmont Books. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Belmont Books is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Mass. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, and they can be seen on our website, which is belmontbooks.com, and that's also where you can purchase Jeff's book. You can send any questions through the chat that some of you have already been writing in, and Tom is going to take a look through those towards the end of the conversation, and he'll be moderating it. This event will be recorded and may be put on YouTube for people to watch. So I would just like to introduce our two guests tonight. Jeff Benedict is a special features writer for Sports Illustrated and has written 16 books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller Tiger Woods with Armen Keteyian. And his newest book, which we'll be talking about tonight, Dynasty, is also a New York Times bestseller. His books and stories have been the basis of segments on 60 Minutes, CBS Sunday Morning, HBO Real Sports, Discovery Channel, Good Morning America, and more. And he's also a television and film producer, and he lives in Connecticut, which I believe is where he's broadcasting from tonight. Oh, I'm so sorry if I'm speaking too quietly. I will try to speak up. Thank you, Ellen. Okay, and our other guest tonight is Tom Curran, who is a journalist based in Boston, and he is a New England Patriots and NFL insider for NBC Sports Boston. He's also a reporter for the Patriots on Comcast Sportsnet New England, and is the host of the show Quick Slants. I am going to hand it over to Jeff and Tom now.
All right, Rebecca, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the 30 people in here so far. We're going to get a few more, definitely, as Rebecca mentioned. But as she said, can you guys hear me fine? Give me a thumbs up, somebody down in the chat, if you could, on the Say Something Nice area. Awesome. Thanks, guys. We're not here to listen to me. We're here to listen to Jeff Benedict. So, Jeff, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for writing the book. If people are here, they're Patriots fans or they're fans of you, friends and family. But when you set out to write the book, The Dynasty, when did the seed germinate and how?
Well, first, before I answer the question, Tom, let me just say thanks to you for going right from your television show seconds ago, being live on the air, to doing this. Sure. I appreciate the pivot, and it was fun listening to you as we were waiting to do this. And this is our second time because your podcast was fantastic when we did that a few weeks ago. As far as the idea germinating that you mentioned, the truth is, I think when I came on your show with you and Michael, which would have been over 2 years ago, you guys were kind enough to have me on up in Boston back when we could actually be in the studio together. And we talked about the Tiger Woods biography. And when we were in studio, I was totally focused on trying to figure out how to get to do this book. And obviously we didn't talk about that night, but I was deep in thought about how to do it. By that time, I had already written to Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, the old fashioned way. I'd written a letter and was just trying to get my arms around what would be the right entry point to this franchise and to try to do this story.
It's funny because I've spoken to him since the book came out just to tell him I really liked it and that I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know prior. And that, I think, folks, is for those of you who do not yet have the book, pick it up at Belmont Books. But for those of you who haven't read it, we get to learn a lot more about Robert Kraft. And there's things about Robert Kraft and the Kraft family that we knew, but we didn't know the depth of things. So when I spoke to him, he said, we've had more than 25 different authors requested, and we love Jeff. And, you could do a lot worse than Jeff Benedict. That's a good Robert. I know when I do a good impersonation. So what do you think? And I find this stuff interesting. We'll get to the book, but what do you think it was about you that made him say, of those 25 different people, all right, let's go with Jeff. I want to tell our story now.
I'm not sure, Tom. I'm probably a little uncomfortable answering that question for him, but here's what I would say is that because this is at least the part that I know, is that unlike you, I was a complete outsider, and I really didn't have any institutional knowledge of this team. There's a bunch of guys, you and Michael at the top of that list, but who've been around this organization for what seems like forever. And I'm not that. I had not been around this team at all in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I remember, Tom, this would be going back even further than the Tiger Woods book. When I was working on Steve Young's biography with him, I was following Steve around on Monday nights for the ESPN broadcast. I remember one time we came to Gillette Stadium because they were hosting a Monday night game, and Steve's book had just come out. Mm-hmm. And so I was there with Steve, and I was actually giving out signed copies of Steve's book to Patriots fans. And before the game, we were down on the field, and Robert came out of the tunnel, and he liked Steve a lot. And he and Steve got into this great conversation, and I was just standing right there listening to it. I don't know that Robert wouldn't have known me from anybody at that time, but I was standing there, and at that time, Steve and I had talked privately about the fact that I was so interested in the Patriots and the franchise and everything else. And so there were a lot of moments where this, was just on my mind. But I think for Robert, it was interesting when I showed up as someone who he didn't know and who was a bit of a novice to the team. And I didn't really have any preconceptions. This is something you and I have talked about offline. I didn't have preconceptions about him or the organization. I really was just hungry to learn as much as I could, much like going into Tiger Woods. It was starting with a clean slate.
What did you learn about, and you spoke to everybody, you spoke to Brady, you spoke and corresponded with Bill Belichick, which I'd love to get into a little bit too. Oh, my battery is running low, folks. I am in a studio and not plugged in. I may have to relocate. I hope you guys will be okay with that, but it's better than me dropping off. I think we're sucking battery here. So we're going to relocate while I pose this question, folks, and I apologize.
This is talent. This takes real talent to do what you're doing, Tom.
Tell me this, then. You spoke to everybody, all the principals involved, many, many people on different levels, but what was it about Robert Kraft that you learned that you didn't really know going in? And we look at him as he's been kind of lampooned, especially early in his ownership, as an attention-grabbing guy on the make who was just happy to be in the old boys club. And it doesn't do enough service to I'll use the word genius, of his leveraging and finding a way to get this team and keep it here. Now I go find a plug.
All right. I'll answer while you do that. That's a great question. And I actually, when I got to know Robert and his son, Jonathan, and what Robert was going through when he purchased the team, one thing that became clear to me was he actually didn't necessarily certainly didn't seek out the attention that he was getting when he first bought the team. I think it was more a function of necessity for him. This was a team that was in serious trouble financially. They were a losing franchise. He was trying as a businessman to get this organization up off the ground, to get some lift, to get some wind under his wings, so to speak. And that required him to be out in front much more than he was used to as someone who had become a paper and shipping and packaging magnate. Those were businesses that he ran quite successfully before owning the Patriots. And those businesses never required him to be in the public spotlight or to be a visible face of his business. But when he came into the NFL, it became imperative or necessity for him to do that. And I think he did it. Doesn't mean he liked it. I think it was just something that he had to do. I'd also say that I think by the time that Bill Belichick and Tom Brady arrived, which is obviously 6 years after Kraft bought the team, they quickly emerged as the two brightest stars in the NFL. And I think at that point, when Kraft recognized how big of stars they were, and I think also appreciated how much brighter they were going to become. He was perfectly willing, unlike perhaps someone like Jerry Jones, perfectly willing to slip back behind the curtain and allow Brady and Belichick to occupy the spotlight.
Deepest apologies for my disappearance. I'm glad that we got up so quickly again. With that, in explaining Robert's role, his machinations to secure the team, they were really fascinating. And you made this point when we talked earlier. Each of these individuals, whether it be Belichick or Kraft or Brady, the 3 points of that triangle, all are just really gifted, driven, and visionary in what they're all trying to do. What was it about Kraft that was so visionary in what he was trying to do? I mean, whether it's Brady as an underdog or Belichick as an underdog or Kraft as an underdog, all of them seem to share that ability to envision themselves as something greater than what their position has them in.
I agree with that. And I think, Tom, that starting with Kraft, in his case, he knows that he's an outsider. He's not part of the NFL club when he buys the team. But I think the first time that he met with then Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, which was over lunch in New York, a meeting that was set up by Will McDonough before Kraft even owned the team. That was such an unusual meeting because at that time, Tagliabue wouldn't even meet with owners, never mind someone who wanted to be an owner. But in that meeting that McDonough brokered, what Tagliabue saw in Kraft was a series of characteristics that he didn't see in any other owner that currently was in play in the NFL. He saw a guy that went to the Boston Symphony. He saw a guy that owned a television station in Boston. He saw a guy that had done business in the Middle East and in China and in Canada. He saw a guy who had built a company in Newfoundland. This was someone who he was actually a lot more like Tagliabue. Tagliabue loved classical music. He loved world travel. He loved a lot of things that you wouldn't think of associating with football. Mm-hmm. I think in Kraft, he saw this outlier entrepreneurial guy who he thought might actually be able to save this franchise and be beneficial to the league. And so that's Kraft. And I think to Kraft's benefit, when he saw Belichick as an assistant coach under Parcells in New England that one season, he saw things in Belichick that I don't think any other owner or NFL executive at that time was seeing and appreciating. He saw it because Kraft goes to practice all the time. You know this because you're around the team. He's an owner who goes, he doesn't meddle. He's not like Jerry Jones, but he is at practice and he's watching like an eagle. And I think that one year when Bill was there, what he loved about it was seeing the way Bill taught young guys like Lawyer Malloy, Ty Law, Teddy Bruschi, Willie McGinnis, and he saw the way they responded to him, which was really different. Not that they didn't respond to Parcells, but they responded differently to Bill Belichick. And so this is entrepreneurial from Kraft's standpoint to pick a coach who's also entrepreneurial or innovative. And Bill, I think Bill never gets enough credit for how innovative he is. Yep. And then there's Tom. And I think this goes to Belichick's genius is he has this innate ability to see things in players that other people overlook. And I hear this criticism all the time, like, well, if Bill was so smart, then why did he wait so long to draft Tom? Well, the answer is because that was the last thing they needed that year was a quarterback.
And we're hearing the same thing in 2020 about Cam Newton. I hate to interject, but it's, these are criticisms that seem to be the court of last resort or the last thing you can do. Well, if they're so smart, why'd they do that? Well, yeah, they did it. Okay. So bottom line, I do want to ask you something and I don't want to make this so organized because I think it's such a fun book because there's so much information. The perception is, you said that Robert Kraft is not a guy who meddles, but the perception that he does was very well fed by the quote from Bill Parcells that if they want you to cook the dinner, they should at least let you shop for the groceries.
Yeah.
There are, to this day, stereotypes about Robert Kraft that Bill Parcells spawned that he's never going to get out from.
Yeah.
What was the Parcells-Kraft relationship like, and how have things gone since with you and the tuna?
Well, that's a double-barrel question. The relationship with Parcells and Kraft was explosive. I mean, it was like kindling that was just always ready to be lit. And there were many times when it, certainly escalated into a fire. And I think that quote, which was a parting shot that Parcells delivered as he left New England, it stuck with Kraft ever since. And I think one of the problems with it is it's so inaccurate, because if you think about it, what Robert really did, and it's the reason that Bill uses that quote, it really stems from the Terry Glenn draft, where Parcells didn't want to draft Terry Glenn and Bobby Greer wanted to. And what Kraft did was, it wasn't that he told, this is the interesting thing, he didn't tell Greer who to draft. What he basically did was he told Parcells, I'm going with Greer. Greer is essentially the GM. So it's his call here. If he wants Terry Glenn, I'm backing the GM. And so if you look at how Kraft has handled Belichick, it's the opposite of meddling. And a perfect example is the Drew Bledsoe situation. When Drew Bledsoe was injured in the 2001 season and then cleared medically to return halfway through, he's Kraft's guy. I mean, he is, at that time, his relationship with Bledsoe was similar to what his relationship with Brady would become. So he could have stepped in and told Belichick, you got to play Bledsoe because I'm paying him $103 million, not to hold a clipboard on the sideline. He didn't do that. He gave Belichick the latitude. And I think that, to me, is the strongest example of how much discipline Kraft had as an owner. I hate to keep going back to Jerry Jones, but there's no way that Jerry Jones does that in that situation.
Well, he blew it up today, too, Jerry Jones did. He made a comment about Dak Prescott not being able to do something that Tony Romo or other great quarterbacks would have done in the final quarters. But
not to duck your question, Tom.
What's that?
I don't want to duck the other part of that question you asked.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, because I have bookmarks I'm putting all over the place.
I mean,
we're going to talk meddling, and we're going to talk Belichick as a teacher. But go ahead, give me the other part on the tuna.
Well, talking to Parcells was
and let me interject. The tuna stuff is phenomenal, folks. So when you read this, the bully that you perceived him to be, it's pretty much laid bare with a couple anecdotal exchanges that you'll see. But go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry.
I think the Parcells stuff is fascinating because in his case, you mentioned the bullying and all this other stuff. I mean, I got some great stories from Paul Tagliabue about Parcells, from Chad Gifford, the CEO of Bank Boston, about Parcells, from Don Lowry, who is the VP of Communications for the Patriots, who dealt with Parcells every day. Some of the most explosive stories in the book about Parcells didn't come from Kraft. In fact, he didn't really tell me many stories about Parcells. I had to tell him the stories that I was getting from other people, just in an effort to try to get some corroboration. But I also did talk to Parcells, and Parcells was really interesting. And I think his interaction with me was a lot like some of the stories in the book. I mean, it was contentious at times, but it was an opportunity to go through these conversations. And I actually enjoyed talking to Bill. I think he is entertaining and funny. And the personality that you see in the book that we saw when he was a coach is still there. I mean, it's why he's one of the most colorful figures in the annals of NFL history over the last 50 years.
Ellen Famigliette. I'm taking a run at it. I love trying to pronounce difficult names. Anyway, Ellen asked a question. Asked a question in the chat that I was wondering as you said it about Bledsoe, that Kraft was hands off. There is a perception. I've reported that this is not what happened. It was fed in 2017 that Robert Kraft sent an edict to Belichick that you're not going to trade Tom Brady. You have to trade Jimmy Garoppolo. And I've had Kraft tell me that's a bleeping lie after having told me on other occasions that it wasn't true. He finally had enough when I asked him again. But certainly Bill, I don't think it ever rose to the level of Bill asking, hey, is it okay if I trade Tom? Because he knew what the answer was going to be. What is your well-informed opinion or the factual aspects of what happened there?
To me, Tom, I'm obviously really familiar with the reporting that was out there about this being an edict from Kraft. And I just approached this very straight on when I was asking questions about this and going through the story. And to me, there's a couple things that I think are important here. Number one, in the email correspondence that I had with Bill Belichick, where he talked about the relationship that he has with Kraft and how it works. And basically what Belichick said is that they agree on most things. They have a good, very efficient way of working. It's worked for 20 years. And most of the time, they're on the same page with big decisions. When they're not, and this is what Belichick said to me, is that when they're not, he is very well aware that at the end of the day, this is Kraft's team. He's the owner. Mm-hmm. And so I think, as for context, let's just remember that and set it aside for a second. And then we look at Kraft's part of this, who has this unique relationship with Tom Brady that goes all the way back to the beginning, but particularly in 2010, when they have this summit out on the Cape and they're talking about Tom's future and his contract and his relationship with Belichick. And they have a handshake kind of eye-to-eye agreement that's never put in writing, but there's an understanding that if Belichick is ever going to trade Brady or bench him, that Kraft will basically protect him. And that is really important in terms of the relationship going forward with Brady. I think when it comes to Garoppolo,
protect him meaning giving Tom the autonomy to say, "You're going to do that? I want out."
Yeah, to give him the opportunity to be put into a better situation. It's like being a free agent without technically being a free agent.
Okay.
And I think that relationship was essential, and that kind of security was essential for Tom's agent, Don Yee. And by the time you get to Garoppolo, we know why Bill drafted him, and I think it was a smart draft. He is potentially the successor, the future. And I've said before, Tom, that I would liken this to what Bill Walsh did when he had Joe Montana, who was the king of the NFL, but seemed like in Bill's eyes was getting toward the end. His body was rickety, and he thought he needed a successor. So he went out and got Steve Young, who was young and athletic and the future. And he brings him in. And what it does is it lights a fire under Joe Montana, who then takes the 49ers to 2 straight Super Bowls and has arguably the 2 finest years statistically of his career, while Steve Young is on the sideline holding a clipboard but nipping at his heels. And I think there's a parallel here. I'm not saying that Belichick tried to do that, nor do I think Walsh was trying to do that, but that's the practical effect of Garoppolo is look what happens with Tom. Look at the years when Garoppolo is on the sideline. Tom Brady is playing like he's on another planet.
14, they win the Super Bowl. He has an incredible year. 15, they were strapped by injury, but 16 comes back after the suspension and plays at an MVP level. And 17, he wins the MVP. All of this at the age of 40, which is really an astounding performance, which may well never be matched again as we see Drew Brees go south. We'll see if the Patrick Mahomes are able to maintain, et cetera. But it is. Did Bill know? I haven't asked you this. Did Bill know about the handshake agreement?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question, Tom. But I think what's really clear, and it's sort of one of those things, it doesn't need to be spoken. Bill really is clearly aware of the depth of the personal relationship that Tom has with Robert and Robert has with Tom. I mean, and I think that, and also Bill is seeing Tom playing on another level those 4 years. And so he hangs on to Jimmy as long as he can as insurance, just in case Tom gets hurt or does go down, because that can happen any moment in the NFL. But when it got to the trade deadline in the 4th year, he pulls the trigger. He calls Robert before he does it. tells him what the opportunity is with the 49ers, makes sure that Robert's okay with it. Robert is, and they pull the trigger. And I think that's the way they operate.
Mm-hmm. Let's now talk about Bill Belichick a little bit, if you could, and what you found out about him to admire and how maddening he must be to work for and with at times.
I think most people that we associate with genius, and that word gets thrown around probably a lot more loosely than it should, but the reality is when you're around anybody who's the best in the world at one thing, it's common that they're difficult to deal with. And the reason they're difficult is because they operate on a plane that no one else is on. And so they can be a lot more impatient. They are used to things being a certain way. They're usually steps ahead of everybody else. And so this is not, to me, surprising that Bill is that way and comes off the way he does. I think that's what you get when you get the best. And similarly, you could say the same thing about Tom and Robert. I mean, that's the thing that's so unique about this organization. They have three men in the key positions: owner, coach, quarterback. All three of them, you could argue, are the best in the business at what they do. And the fact that they coexisted for 20 years without taking each other to pieces it's astounding. I mean, to me,
that's what Robert takes victory lap after victory lap verbally when I speak to him. And I'm sure he's did it 25 more times with you about, do you see what I kept together? I went from Bill Parcells to Bill Belichick, and I kept it together. Let me ask you this. Would any of them have succeeded at the level they did, even close to the level they did, with 33% of those factors not in place? If it was Bill and Robert without a quarterback, if it was Robert and Tom without Bill, if it was those two guys with Dan Snyder or Jerry Jones or, Shad Khan or whoever, or was that melange necessary?
Yeah, I don't think that you would have seen. I'm not saying that this franchise wouldn't have won some Super Bowls without one of the three, but I don't think we would have. We've watched in the last 20 years, America has watched the greatest sports dynasty, certainly in football, in the history of the NFL, arguably one of the greatest American sports dynasties ever. It's right up there with the Mantle DiMaggio Yankees, with the Bill Russell Celtics. And I don't think it would have reached that level without the three of them united for 20 years. And the reason I give as much credit as I do to Kraft is because I think one of the things that was brilliant on his part was he saw early on that he had Lennon and McCartney on his payroll. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes a lot. Like, on one hand, you need to be incredibly confident, almost to the point of seeming arrogant, to succeed in this business because it's so cutthroat. So on one hand, you got to have that chutzpah, and Robert has that. But on the other hand, there's this unique mixture of humility, which is a weird word when you think about football and greatness. But for Robert to sort of be humble enough to step back and basically not push, but allow his two stars to occupy and dominate the spotlight. So for 20 years, the whole discussion about who's the biggest contributor to the dynasty, is it Bill or is it Tom? Robert's never in that conversation. And one of the things I was trying to do in the book was show he belongs in that conversation. Mm-hmm. Because his role in this is like the ultimate diplomat. That's why there's a chapter in the book called Shuttle Diplomacy. Robert Kraft has done shuttle diplomacy in Foxborough for the last 10 years. And I think without that, they have 3 Super Bowls on their resume, not 6.
And that's because he's gone back and forth as the Carter to the Sadat and Begin.
Yes, yes.
I watched a lot of national news when I was a kid. I'm going to go a little bit rapid fire. Before I do, I wanted to ask you, is there any place that you want to go that I haven't taken you yet?
The only one, I saw a question come in from somebody, and I can't see it now because there's so many more that have come in, but someone asked about Connecticut and Roger Goodell's role in keeping the Patriots in New England. And if it's okay with you, Tom,
Absolutely.
I'd like to field that one because Roger Goodell, as you well know, becomes public enemy number one in the 6 New England states when he brings the hammer down on Tom Brady and the Patriots for Deflategate. I think that story is so much richer when you backpedal all the way to the beginning of Roger Goodell's relationship with the Kraft family and with the Patriots organization. And that really takes root when Paul Tagliabue is the commissioner and Goodell is his top deputy, and the Patriots are not thinking about moving to Connecticut. They're going to Connecticut. Mm-hmm. They have been shown the door by Tom Finneran and the politicians in Massachusetts, and they're going to Hartford. And they're into a contract. And the state of Connecticut has signed a law, and they have appropriated hundreds of $millions of state money to build a stadium. This is not an idea. This is a happening. And it's at that point that Roger Goodell enters the story. And he enters because of a great thing that actually happens outside a coffee shop in Chestnut Hill when Jonathan Kraft, who doesn't want to move to Hartford any more than Robert does, but knows that they really don't have a choice. And one Saturday morning, he bumps into who? Senate Leader Tom Birmingham, who is sick and tired of Finneran and doesn't want the Patriots to leave, and basically approaches Jonathan Kraft outside the coffee shop and says, "Is there anything we can do?" And
so he wasn't staking him out, right? That's just a happenstance meeting.
It's a wonderful. This is something like when the movie gets made about this book. This is a great scene. It's when when Tom Birmingham is taking a drag on a cigarette, standing face to face with Jonathan Kraft, who's the epitome of health, and blows the smoke, and then is trying to find a way to ask him the question. And Jonathan knows legally he can't talk about it. And he basically says, "I can't talk about this." But he suggests he might want to call Roger Goodell. And the funny thing is, Birmingham doesn't, who the heck is that? And Jonathan has to spell his name for him and then tells him this conversation never happened. And within a couple of days, Roger Goodell is in his New York office at NFL headquarters, and he gets a phone call from who? Tom Birmingham. And this is the call that Roger Goodell has been waiting for. He runs down to Commissioner Tagliabue's office and basically says, "This is our opening." And the reason he wants this is because the New York Giants and the New York Jets are raising Cain about the fact that they don't want the Patriots in Connecticut because that's New York territory. That's one of the tri-states. It's their fan base. It'll screw up the new television deal that Robert Kraft just helped deliver. There's Rooney in Pittsburgh is pressuring the league to figure out a way to keep them in Boston. And now there's a way. And Goodell says, "We got to do this." And Tagliabue dispatches him to Boston with a code name, checks him into a hotel. And Goodell starts working the politicians in the business community with the help of, lo and behold, Dan Rooney in Pittsburgh. And to make a long story short, he produces a deal that they then bring to Kraft. And Kraft has to make this decision between taking what was a crappy deal in Massachusetts to stay or a deal in Connecticut that would have made him the richest owner in the NFL. And as Will McDonough said, Kraft did a thing that there aren't many people in this business would have done. And he decides to drop the deal in Connecticut, walks away from $1 billion and goes home and takes this crappy deal and pays for a stadium, Gillette, that they build with their own money, and the rest is history. That's how Goodell comes into the story, which makes it so much richer when we all know what happens later.
And it's so funny because if you go next level on Goodell, because he was a New York Jets intern, that's the ulterior motive. You can say, "Oh, he saved the Patriots for Boston," but you can also say he was doing the Jets a solid. That's what was going on there. I do want to go a little bit rapid fire because there's so much good stuff, and I also want to give an opportunity to folks to bang their questions in. But Antonio Brown shows up very early in the book. The machinations behind his signing really tested the Kraft. It actually pitted Kraft versus Brady Belichick in this instance, didn't it?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, Tom, because it's clear, right? This is chapter 1 in the book, and there's a great scene where, you have Antonio Brown basically telling the world, I don't want to play for the Raiders anymore. I want out. And the league announces that he's going to be available that afternoon. And as usual, Belichick is one pace ahead of everybody else, but the clock is ticking and there's a lot of other teams hovering. And this is where you see how this relationship with Kraft and Belichick works. Kraft is waiting. He knows he's going to get a call. He knows it. And so he calls, and basically Belichick tells him what the deal can be and what they can do. And it's a hang-up moment where what does Kraft do? The first thing he does is he calls Brady, and he discusses the possibility with him. And it's interesting because that is not what Belichick would do. Belichick would not call Tom. And that's actually a source of friction in that relationship, is that Tom's been there for 2 decades. Maybe it doesn't make sense to consult with him about who the next defensive tackle should be. But you would think after 20 years and becoming the greatest quarterback ever, that a decision about a receiver of Antonio Brown's stature might make sense for the coach and the quarterback to have a conversation, but that doesn't happen. But it does happen between the owner and the quarterback. And it's because of what Tom tells Robert, which is how excited he is about the prospect of having Antonio Brown join the roster. That turns the tide for Robert, because Robert's not comfortable with this idea, but he gets comfortable because Tom is comfortable. And what Robert wants most is he wants Tom to finish his career in New England. And if this becomes a possible way to keep Tom grounded there for the last couple of years, it's worth doing. And I think that whole dynamic is so interesting because it just shows how it works.
It's funny too, but because Robert didn't know that the ship had already sailed in Tom's mind, as Brady acknowledged on Howard Stern, and as I kind of reported last year, once they got where they got in the 2019 offseason going into the year, Brady was ready to walk away from the team in training camp in 2019 based upon the contract that he was not getting and the amount of time it took. What's also interesting about that is, Jeff, is after Al Michaels spoke on Sunday Night Football about the Brady texting back and forth, and Brady texted back another time and said, I'm behind it 1,000%. We asked Brady about that, and Brady was pissed that Kraft had shared that, and he made that clear. So there was so much going on in 2019 in different directions. But that Antonio Brown, see, I want to go rapid fire. I can't. There's so many layers to all of it. I'm going to ask, these people have been good enough to jump on. And I love the fact that we have all of these people. We've got the same number of people here still. Gary Phelan asked that question about the Connecticut. We appreciate that. Bill Taylor asking the question, a couple of them, which are both good. Where do you believe the Patriots will be when they are in the hands of Jonathan Kraft, which ultimately will happen? And Jonathan's told me, don't ask me about that. I don't even want to think about that. Yeah. So that's one question. And his second question, Bill, and thank you, is about Will McDonough and his influence with Kraft and the way things ended up at the end with Robert Kraft. Sadly, Will McDonough dying, and I believe it was 2005 or 6.
So 2 really good questions, Tom. I'll just take them in the order that they came in. As far as Jonathan goes, I couldn't, as a journalist and someone who's just like curiosity is, I am endlessly curious. And so doing a book like this, I was fascinated by Jonathan and the relationship, the father-son relationship between Robert and Jonathan. That's why I write about it so much in the book. I think the family part of the Dynasty story is, to me, it's golden. I mean, it's storybook stuff. And I love the way that Jonathan joins the organization from day one. I mean, from the moment that Robert buys the team, Jonathan is to his father what Bobby Kennedy was to his brother. I mean, it's that kind of relationship. And to me, it's just Jonathan has learned at the side of the master, and so when you think of succession, which he doesn't like to think about or talk about, which I admire that about him. But when Patriots fans think about it, I think there should be some solace in knowing that he is the one who has been at his father's side, who has been the master of this whole process. And Jonathan's been there for everything, the ups, the downs, the brutal, the great. And so, he's
unabashedly volatile and emotional. Volatile is the wrong word. That was not a fair word. In case he clicks on this, sees it on YouTube, and then I get, what the hell? He's emotional. He wears his heart on his sleeve, and he does speak his mind.
Yeah, I remember when I was working on this book, Tom. You'll appreciate this. I spent a ton of time at NFL Films, living in the archive there and watching audio and video that has not been aired before.
I haven't moved, so my lights just went out in here.
No problem. There was one time I was watching some old clips at NFL Films of the Patriots back in the 2001 season. So they're going for their first Super Bowl. And it's when Bledsoe replaces Brady in the Steelers game in the AFC Championship because Brady goes down. And there's a clip that NFL Films had. There was a camera shot on the owner's box in Pittsburgh. It's short, but it's when Drew throws a touchdown pass, which was fantastic. And it kind of puts the dagger into the Steelers. And Jonathan Kraft is in the booth, in the box, and the intensity on his face and how fired up he is in that moment, like what you just described, like you see it. And I actually took a still picture with my cell phone of what I was seeing on the video because I just thought, wow, like there's some serious intensity there. But it runs throughout the whole organization, and I think it stems from the top.
It's amazing when you have people who are that volatile and can be that emotional and are that friggin' smart and that successful, that a Jonathan can deal with a Bill and a Bill can deal with a Jonathan, and Tom can be, throughout the whole thing. It's fascinating. I got a few more questions, and I want to hit them all before we get to 8 because we got a hard out, I think.
Yep.
Dennis Roy with a good question of who did you speak to most for the book, Brady, Kraft, or Belichick? And please illuminate folks, because Bill on the radio at the beginning of the season tried to downplay his involvement with the book. I thought that was interesting. But first that part and then the second.
Sure. I wasn't aware of that because I didn't hear him on the radio. So I don't have any familiarity with what he said, but
yeah, I mean, I knew the book was being written, but I mean, yeah, it's not very involved at all.
So what I did with Bill is I would just put this context around it, is that whenever you're doing a book like this, Tom, and you know this from what you do, that you just get very grateful for any time that you get with anyone who's sort of in this stratosphere and has the demands on them that they have. And so I went into this with no assumptions about getting interviews with anybody. And so whatever Robert or Jonathan or Bill or Tom, or for that matter, Drew or Willie McGinnis or anybody else was willing to give me, I'm enormously grateful. If it's 15 minutes, I'll take it. And in the case of Belichick, at his request, he wanted the questions written down in advance. I do that. Sometimes I'll do it on my own because I like to give people the opportunity to think about the questions before we do the interview. This is not a gotcha book, and so I'm not looking to surprise anybody. On the contrary, I want people to be thoughtful. And so I obliged and gave Bill a really absurdly lengthy list of questions, very detailed, some of which were probably about things he wasn't necessarily accustomed to being asked about. But after looking them over, he decided that he wanted to answer in writing. And I was like, great, because there's upsides and downsides to doing this either way, whether you sit with someone or whether they give you answers in writing. But the upside of getting answers in writing, especially from someone like Belichick, and I say especially like him, is because he's already a thoughtful guy. When he speaks, he's careful. And so it takes even more care to write something out than to say it. Like what we're doing tonight is easy. We're just talking. But when you have to write things out, you got to think about it. It takes a lot more time. And so he wanted to do it that way. And I thought the answers that he gave, did he answer every question? No, but he answered enough. And I thought the ones he answered, that his answers were illuminating, they were helpful, and I was super appreciative. To put it in context, Randy Moss, similarly, he wanted the questions in writing in advance because he wanted to know, like, what do you want to talk to me about? And so I did the same thing. And again, I was expecting to have a oral interview with Randy, but he did a similar thing. After reading my questions, I got this email from ESPN saying, Randy has recorded his answers, and they sent me a digital file. And basically, Tom, he stood on the sideline of an ESPN Monday Night Football game, which he is a commentator on, and recorded the answers with a production member of the crew, and then sent me the file. It was fantastic. No. I mean, I didn't need to talk to Randy because this was great stuff. And so it's whatever you can get. In Tom Brady's case, these were face-to-face interviews that I did with him at the stadium. They were among the best interviews I've done in my career. I thought he was incredibly forthright. I thought he was honest to the core. And I loved what he showed me. And when I say what he showed me was I mean that I felt like at times he was sort of bearing his soul.
Tell me that story about your first meeting with him that didn't seem to be starting off on the right foot.
Yeah, it's great. The first time I met Tom for this book the first time I interviewed him, not the first time I met him, but the first time I interviewed him, he walked into his suite. I had been sitting in there alone for 3 hours getting prepared for this interview. And when he walked in, he said, actually, I can't use exactly the words he used on this medium because it's a 4-letter word, but he said, I've had a blankety day and crappy day, but different word. And he was clearly not in a great mood. And, it was sort of his way of just saying, he apologized, but he just said, it's been a really crappy day. He wasn't in a great mood. And he sat down, and it led to us having a conversation because I figured this is not a good time to just go into the interview. And so we talked for like 20 minutes, and I found that to be really great because I felt like a rapport was built, a connection was made. And by the time we started the interview 20 minutes later, it went fantastic. And
that's a hard spot to be in because you're probably sitting there saying, well, he's in a crap mood already.
Yeah.
Do I make it worse by dragging it out and starting to try and make him feel better? Or do I just get into the questions and get him on his way home? But the way you do your writing and the way you're an archaeologist, you have a very savvy way of doing things that doesn't apologize for trying to tell the story, which I think as a reporter, I appreciate because you don't apologize for putting the effort in. You realize that you're doing them, Kraft, Belichick, Brady, the consumer, a favor by getting it.
I thought, like, when we go back to Belichick for a minute, and certainly with Brady, I sent Brady, and I did this with Robert at times too, is I would send them things via email so they would know in advance what I wanted to talk about. And so actually what Bill wanted me to do, I was kind of already doing that with a lot of people in this book anyways. It's just preparation. But part of the thing, Tom, is I think when you commit your question, this sort of is counterintuitive for journalists. Journalists go, hey, give them questions in advance. Well, wait a second. Let's think about what are we doing here? This is not a Washington Post Watergate story. I'm trying to write like a biography, essentially, of a franchise. And I do want to dig really deep. And I think the benefit of laying out the questions in advance and sending them to people in writing, one of the things that shows a person, if they're paying attention, and believe me, this organization pays attention, everybody in it does, is it shows them seriousness. Like, what is this really about? Like, what is this guy trying to do? Well, questions tell you that. It's like a roadmap of where I'm trying to go with the book. And I think the benefit of sort of putting all your cards on the table is it's very transparent. It's like, okay, we know what this guy wants to do, but it also is a way of showing the subject, the person you want to interview, how much legwork you've done. And that's one of the reasons I didn't ask Bill, for example. I didn't approach Bill for an interview until like a year into the project, because it took me that long to figure out, what do I want to ask him?
Right.
Like, what do I want to know? And I didn't know enough in the beginning. Like, I didn't know what I didn't know at that point. And so it took me a year to figure out what I didn't know and what I wanted to know. And then I felt like by the time I sent him the questions, he could at least see. Doesn't mean he's going to say yes at that point, but at least he could see with some clarity where I was going and what I wanted to do with the subject matter that involved him.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that I gathered from covering him over the last 20 years is, you take it serious, he'll take you serious. If you're a slappy, you're going to get slappy treatment. A couple of different people, Sterling Pingree and Bill Taylor, both asking, what are you going to be working on next?
Oi.
I know. Let the guy take a breath, huh?
I have real quick, I'll just say that I have a documentary film on Tiger Woods that'll be on HBO in December. It's a two-parter, and it's based on the biography I wrote on Tiger Woods 2 years ago, which you're very familiar with. And I am then supposed to write the biography of LeBron James.
He plays hoop
very well.
That's a big burger you got there.
Yeah. Well, the Patriots are big burger.
That's a couple of big burgers. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Yeah, exactly. That all says Sterling. Good projects. Folks, we're like I said, a hard out at 8. So if anybody else has any other questions they want to squeeze in, please go ahead and do so. Otherwise, I guess, Jeff, it was fun to read it. Who were some of the most enjoyable folks that you dealt with who were not the principals?
Oh, I love that question. Thanks. I would say one of them would be John Bon Jovi. And, I know John just finished reading the book because he sent me a really nice note over the weekend. In fact, during the Patriots game, I got this great email from John. And obviously, I didn't know John before working on this book. He is one of the many people that I had the privilege of interviewing in their home. I interviewed Mel Karmazin in his home, Rob Gronkowski in his home. And I think when you go to someone's home to do an interview, you get a really different kind of interview. It's like, it's more intimate and it's a safe, calm space. And that's where I interviewed John Bon Jovi. I didn't meet him. I initially met him in a more public space, in fact, at a Patriots game. But I thought that the stories he contributed to the Dynasty were fantastic. I think his relationship with Parcells and then with Belichick and now with Kraft is so fascinating. And there are these characters like him, Lee Steinberg, the super agent who used to represent Drew Bledsoe and now represents Patrick Mahomes. His connection to Kraft and the Patriots franchise is dynamite. And Lee was great to interview for this book. I think Mel Karmazin, who was, maybe the most powerful media personality at the time of the Patriots' rise, the rise of the dynasty. Mel doesn't do interviews. He sat for one with me. It was fantastic. Sandy Weil, who was the CEO of the biggest bank in America.
So Mel Karmazin, folks don't know who that is. Who was he?
So Mel Karmazin, Bill.
I've forgotten too, to be candid.
Built Xfinity Radio and then became took over CBS.
Okay.
At the time that CBS was out of the NFL because they'd been outbid by Fox and Rupert Murdoch and was now dying to get back in because the network was collapsing without the NFL contract. Mel Karmazin is the one who's trying to figure out, how do we come up with enough money to get back in the game? And his relationship with Kraft is so instrumental in that happening. And also, he's the one who helped make Howard Stern. And right. Of course, Howard Stern pops up in this book as well. So there's a lot of characters like that, Tom. Bono and The Edge, who slip into this narrative and I think add the glitz that the Patriots story deserves.
You mentioned that you interviewed Gronk in his home.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? I mean, the authenticity of him that I picked up over the years of knowing him. It's rude to call a 30-year-old childlike, but he is childlike in his enthusiasm and honesty, I think. Did you experience that, or was he too nervous? Because other times he's too friggin' nervous to be of any use.
Well, Tom, so the interview I did with Rob at his home was conducted last year. So this is the season where he's not playing. He's retired from the Patriots. It's the 19 season, which is the frustrating year for Tom and everyone else. And it was actually did the interview right before the first game of the 19 season. So they're going to play Pittsburgh at home, and they're going to unveil the banner from the Super Bowl the year before. And it was that week that I went to Rob's house in Foxborough, the one right near the stadium. And it was interesting because I was meeting Rob for the first time. I'd seen him and been around him during the 18 season because I was around the team a lot that year, but I hadn't interviewed Rob. And this was that interview in his house. And what I found was I would use the word warmth. I mean, the hospitality that he showed me and the care that he took for me. Here's an example. I had hurt my back really bad. And in fact, Tom Brady had introduced me to Alex Guerrero for back treatment because in one of my interviews, Tom saw that I could hardly sit down. I had hurt my back. And it was shortly after that interview with Tom when he introduced me to Alex that I went to Rob's house. And Rob had just started being a spokesman for the ointment that he's now helping market. And he gave me some. He's like, you really should try this, because he said, what are you using for your back? And I showed him this product that I had. And he goes, look, this is a lot better. And he said, let me get you some. And he brought some in and, gave it to me. And that was actually how the interview started. And so I would just say that there was a genuineness to him, certainly not any nervousness. The conversation we had, the interview was more like a conversation. Mm-hmm. And I said to Rob what I say to a lot of people at the beginning. I said, look, if I ask you something you don't want to talk about, just tell me. We'll go to the next question. This is easy. There might be things in here that you don't want to discuss. And if that's the case, I'm not here to have an uncomfortable interview. Just tell me that, I don't want to talk about it. And the interview was great. And I couldn't say enough about Rob.
This interview's been great too. That's an hour. We only have one computer die.
It doesn't feel like it. Thanks, Tom. You do a great interview. I said this about the podcast. We did it. It's felt like 5 minutes and it was over. Yeah. So,
keep going.
You're a pro.
You're a pro. Rebecca, you coming back on to tell anybody anything about anything?
I'm trying. Hi. Thank you so much to both of you. This was super informative. And thank you to everybody who came and asked so many great questions. Jeff's book can be purchased at belmontbooks.com. And I hope you all have a great night. Thanks again.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, folks who jumped in. Ellen, Sterling, Bill, Sam, Dennis. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
See ya.